Ummah is not so strong. Who's a Muslim? Depends on you ask. If you think about it, and I still don't understand the logic of this, and maybe some Muslims out there could help me out. Now, let's get this right. If rejecting Hadith makes someone a heretic or a kafir, then wouldn't that mean that all Sunnis should reject Shia, because Shia use a different canonical group of Hadith? There's a few overlapping Hadith, but for the most part they use different canonical Hadith. All right. And again, who's a Muslim? Sunni, Shia, Sufi, Salafi, Quranist? All right. I only say that because Muslims act like Christianity is so split, but you have Protestants and Catholics, and Roman Catholics are not Christian. So you're left with Protestants. If you have conservative Protestants, we agree in the fundamentals of the faith, you're a Christian, regardless of your denomination. But that's for another video. So we're going to talk a little bit about Hadith. It's definitely not a science. It's arbitrary methodology. That methodology was not developed as far as what Hadith are legitimate. That quote science was not developed under the Sahaba. Probably another couple generations or more after the Sahaba. So that's something to take into consideration, because at the end of the day, you have people that are Quranists, they reject Hadith, and then you have the Hadithists. Because if the Hadith modifies the Quran, then that's your ultimate authority. You're using a lower standard, a fallible standard, to give the ultimate final meaning of the Quran, which you claim is your ultimate authority. So this modifies this. The Hadith is your ultimate standard if you're a Sunni or even a Shia for the most part. But we could talk about that. But at the end of the day, Hadith is circular reasoning. Why do you believe? Because someone else believes. Or I believe because this Hadith says this and this Hadith says that. It's really circular reasoning. And some of the stuff I'm going to get you is circular reasoning. But again, that shows the problem with the whole methodology. So for example, were Hadith really written down under Umar? Maybe a little bit, but Umar didn't want anything written down with the Hadith. Umar didn't want anything written down with the Quran because he didn't want to confuse anything with the Quran. So very few Hadith were written under Umar, and you'd have to bring a witness, and you'd have to say it verbally. And then supposedly later on, Umar allowed a little bit of this Hadith to be written down. But where am I getting this from? If it's from the Hadith, that's circular reasoning. If it's in the Sirah, if it's, let's say hypothetically, it's under Ibn Ishaq. Ibn Ishaq is criticized because his Hadith chains are not full Hadith chains. So, and there's of course other biographies other than Ibn Ishaq, but you get the concept. Okay. So, if we take someone like Imam Malik ibn Anas, died 795. Yes, you have a small manuscript of PERF 731, but that's by no means a whole manuscript. That's like table scraps. So the whole extant manuscript of Ibn Anas is about more or less 1000 AD, and he was living most of his life in Medina. And yet someone like Sahih Bukhari comes along, dies in 870, never met Malik ibn Anas, and his extant manuscript, a whole one, as far as the earliest one so far I could find, was 1155 in Istanbul. That's over 500 years after Muhammad dies. And only 20 to 25%, if you include Malik ibn Anas and his students, gets incorporated under Sahih Bukhari. So the vast majority of the Muwatta, which was in Medina, which comes 100 years earlier for the most part, before Bukhari dies, most of it is rejected. What's wrong with the Muwatta? Of course, I know Malik ibn Anas wasn't just doing hadith chains, he's also writing his legal survey and his justification for some of these things. But still, it's a problem. Hadith methodology is very arbitrary. I mean, for example, some Muslims would say the mutawatir goes from 100 to 300. So we could say 200, give or take 100. I believe Al-Sayudi put it a little over 100. But if mutawatir is true, why don't you accept the Gospels? Mutawatir. Or what is considered mutawatir? Is it 2 witnesses? Is it 4 witnesses? I mean, even according to Hadith, when under the Uthman recension, under Zayd ibn Thabit, you had to have 2 witnesses. And yet, the last 2 verses of Al-Tahaba, Surah chapter 9, Kazima al-Ansari had, if I'm pronouncing his name right, only 1 witness. Oh, but wait. Supposedly, out of convenience, Muhammad says that his witness counts as 2. Come on, seriously, guys. But again, this is not a science. Give me a break. So yeah, you can look at isnads, you can look at content. Isnad chains can be forged. Content can be forged. We know a lot of hadith was political, Sunni Shia faction, people trying to support their own factions. But if the most mutawatir verse is the fact that anybody who lies intentionally, and there's another mutawatir variant on that, anyone who lies for Muhammad, guess what? They go to hellfire. So according to your own hadith standards, most Muslims are going to hellfire. I mean, my friends, especially my Sunni friends. So how can we, if we're trying to get around some of these very sketchy, arbitrary, man-made methodology of hadith, how can we get around it? Well, sometimes you have to look at the biographies. Sahaba, supposedly many of them couldn't lie, which again is a joke because we have so many forgeries. Bukhari gets rid of supposedly 95% or more of the hadith because there's so many forgeries and forgeries invented upon forgeries. I mean, it's insane. But if you looked at one of the earlier biographies, Ibn Sa'ad died in 845. The largest portion of his work is 1000 AD. Al-Tabakat al-Kubra. Guess what? Ibn Sa'ad was a scribe of Al-Waqidi. And guess what Al-Bukhari said about Al-Waqidi? He has forgeries in his isnads, in his hadith. So, how do we not know that Ibn Sa'ad isn't even plagiarizing some of Al-Waqidi's works? I mean, it just goes on and on and on. But we're not done. We're not done. So, there is, by the way, no complete manuscripts in whole of Ibn Sa'ad. A lot of fragments overlap. There are several recensions. And by the way, not many hadith were translated under Ibn Sa'ad's authority. There was, in the Sirah, a little bit translated. There was some Maghazi stuff, a little bit translated, carried over to people that came after him and put in their works. But as far as hadith goes, it wasn't very authoritative, carried over. But yeah, he wrote about the biography of thousands of the Sahaba, companions of Muhammad. And that's another thing, because Al-Bukhari wrote about some of the companions, but his work is more abrupt, more brief than Ibn Sa'ad. But yet, why is Al-Bukhari's work considered a bit more authoritative than Ibn Sa'ad's work? Questionable. And, Muslims always criticize, well, you have textual criticism with New Testament, which Christians have said that for the last 2,000 years. We've known about that. And yet, there is hadith criticism. Why are the double standards there? And here's another problem. So one of the reasons why Sunnis reject the Ibadis are like 2 to 5 million Muslims, with a good portion of them living in Oman and North Africa. And one of their hadith collections is Jami al-Sahih. But many of the reports, I know they're ahad, but many of the reports go through Jabir ibn Zayd. But many of the Sahih reports go through Abu Huraira. He became a Muslim at around 26 years old, and he was only a Muslim for several years, and then Muhammad died, and yet he's one of your biggest commentator on the hadith. That doesn't sound like, smells like forgery. I mean, come on, guys. Aisha, how well is her character if we're going by the character of the Sahaba when she fought Ali, the battle of the camel? So her character is under question. Now, if you have, let's say, 7,500 hadith, and you have lots of repetitions, and let's say you break that under Sahih al-Bukhari to around 2,500 hadith, Aisha, you have roughly about 2,500 reports, or 10%. And again, questionable character, since she's fighting against Ali. She not only didn't like Ali, she didn't care for Uthman either. So no wonder the Quranist movement is growing. Yes, Muslims consider them heretics. I have no skin in the game because I'm not a Muslim. I'm never going to be a Muslim. And so even if we accept Sahih al-Bukhari, if we accept Sahih Muslim, if we accept Al-Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, and all these players, what do we have left? We have the criteria of embarrassment that some of the stuff in the hadith probably true. But if it's true, how can you say that Muhammad is a prophet, given some of the moral embarrassment on his record, since the Quran says he's an exemplar, you're to follow him, and Muslims elevate him? If Muhammad wasn't born, the world wouldn't be created. I mean, so it's sad, because many Muslims do worship Muhammad, because you can attack the Quran and Muslims will not get angry and upset. But if you attack Muhammad, they will get angry and upset. So something for my Muslim friends to think about.